General Hospital spoilers teased that the tides in Port Charles were shifting quietly but with devastating precision. It wasn't a gunfight in an alleyway or a scandal splashed across headlines. This time, the real war was being fought in whispers, manipulation, and calculated betrayal. At the center of this quiet storm stood Kai, a man who had long straddled the line between loyalty and strategy, between emotional ties and survival. 4 months. He had wrestled with conflicting allegiances, particularly when it came to Trina, the woman he once believed he'd protect above all else. But when Kai discovered that Curtis had finally tracked down Jacinda, something in him snapped, not from rage, not from panic, but from a deep, silent understanding that the time to choose a side had arrived. And Kai chose Drew. The decision wasn't made lightly. Kai knew the weight of what he was doing. He knew the ripple effect would be personal, painful, and irreversible. But he also knew what Curtis was planning. He knew the moment Curtis found Jacinda, she would be used as a pawn to destroy Drew's credibility. Curtis wasn't looking for truth. He was looking for leverage. A lie, dressed as evidence. A fabricated narrative that could be used to paint Drew as a drug user, a manipulator, a man unworthy of public trust or legal standing. And Jacinda, vulnerable, cornered, and far removed from Port Charles for months, would be the tool used to make it all stick. So Kai made the call. Late into the night, while the rest of the city slept, he met Drew in a shadowed corner of the WSB's off-site safe house. He didn't sugarcoat it. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply laid the truth bare. Curtis had found Jacinda. And a meeting was imminent. Every detail was given, how Curtis was coordinating with Felicia to quietly bring Jacinda back into town. How he intended to have a private meeting with her to convince her, if not coerce her, to claim that Drew had paid for a night of intimacy and used drugs willingly, not under manipulation or entrapment. It was a lie designed to destroy Drew's character in court and in public opinion. And if Jacinda agreed, even out of desperation, it would change everything. Drew listened in silence, his jaw tight. His mind already racing several steps ahead. He wasn't shocked. He had long suspected Curtis would go low to protect himself. Especially now that stakes surrounding their legal and personal battles had intensified. But hearing it confirmed from Kai, someone he knew had once been close to Trina, made the betrayal burn deeper. And yet, Drew didn't lash out. He didn't rage. He did what he always did, he began to plan. Step 1 was simple but crucial, he had to reach Jacinda first. Through discreet channels. Drew made contact with her. He kept the message brief, calm, and non-threatening. He didn't beg. He didn't threaten. He simply told her the truth, that Curtis was planning to use her. To paint her into a corner and dangle money in exchange for her testimony. And then he said the one thing that shifted Jacinda's voice from confusion to cooperation: you don't have to lie for him. You just have to let him think you will. Jacinda was stunned. She hadn't spoken to Drew in months. The last time they had crossed paths, it had ended in chaos, pain, and unfinished business. But something in Drew's voice, measured, tired, but resolute, made her pause. He didn't sound like a man looking to win. He sounded like a man trying to survive. And though her own circumstances had left her guarded, even hardened, Jacinda still had enough clarity to see when she was being used. And Curtis, with all his smooth words and practiced charm, was preparing to use her. So she agreed. Not because she trusted Drew completely, but because she knew what it felt like to be a pawn. And this time, she wanted to be the one who flipped the board. With Kai's help, Drew put the next pieces into place. He arranged for surveillance, ensuring that when Curtis sat down with Jacinda, the meeting would be recorded. Not in a flashy, obvious way, but quietly, cleanly. Audio would be enough. A simple file, timestamped and encrypted, capturing Curtis's words as he laid out his offer. Drew didn't want to humiliate Curtis in public. He wanted to neutralize him in private. To hold the truth like a dagger behind his back, ready to strike only when Curtis pushed too far. As the plan took shape, Drew felt the weight of what he was doing press harder against his chest. He wasn't a saint. He had made his share of questionable decisions. But this wasn't about revenge. This was about survival. Curtis had already tried to smear his name. He had worked behind closed doors to destroy Drew's credibility, to isolate him from allies, to undermine every attempt Drew made at rebuilding his life after prison. Now, Curtis was escalating, and Drew had no choice but to respond in kind. When the meeting between Curtis and Jacinda finally happened, it unfolded in a quiet hotel room on the outskirts of Port Charles. Curtis believed he was in control. He spoke in veiled phrases, slipping cash into a sealed envelope, suggesting how much easier things would be if Jacinda simply told the story his way. He played the old tune of opportunity and redemption, framing his manipulation as a favor rather than a threat. Jacinda, coached by Drew in advance, played her part to perfection. She nodded. She asked careful questions. She never once let on that she knew the conversation was being recorded. And across town, Drew and Kai monitored the signal in real time. When Curtis left the meeting, smug and unaware, Drew finally exhaled. He had what he needed. Proof. Not just of Curtis's intent to lie, but of his willingness to bribe, manipulate, and pervert justice to serve his own ends. And now, with the audio file secured, Drew had leverage. But this was more than a tactical victory. This was a shift in power. For the first time in months, Drew wasn't playing defense. He wasn't reacting. He was controlling the board. And Curtis, who had long operated in the shadows under the guise of honor and family loyalty, was now exposed. If Drew chose to release the recording, it could destroy Curtis's standing in court, jeopardize his relationships, and fracture what remained of his already strained alliances. But Drew wasn't impulsive. He wasn't going to go public, not yet. He wanted to use the truth as pressure, not punishment. A warning, back off, or the world hears what you really are. Still, the fallout was unavoidable. Trina learned about Kai's involvement within days. She was blindsided, heartbroken that someone she once trusted had sided with Drew over her family. She confronted Kai in the middle of Rice Plaza, her voice trembling, her questions sharp and furious. "You chose him," she asked. "Over me? Over my father?" Kai didn't defend himself. He simply said, "I chose what was right." But to Trina, the distinction didn't matter. The damage was done. Their relationship fractured, trust shattered. Kai walked away knowing he may never earn her forgiveness, but also knowing he couldn't stand by and let Curtis destroy another man's life out of ego and fear. Drew, meanwhile, returned to his quiet corner of Port Charles with a new resolve. He had survived prison. He had survived isolation. And now, he was surviving Curtis. But this time, he wasn't just surviving. He was fighting back. And for the first time in a long time, he was winning. The atmosphere in Port Charles had never been more tense, more volatile, or more twisted with personal vendettas masquerading as justice. In the middle of it all stood Drew, a man who once believed in redemption, now weaponizing strategy and psychological warfare to dismantle the one person who threatened to erase everything he had rebuilt, Curtis. What began as a bitter rivalry had escalated into something much darker, something far more dangerous, an obsession fueled by betrayal, pride, and a desire for total control. And the woman caught in the crossfire was Jacinda, who had once been nothing more than a peripheral figure in Drew's past, but now found herself at the very center of an explosive confrontation between two men whose war had no rules. Curtis wanted Jacinda back in Port Charles, not because he cared for her well-being, but because she had become the perfect pawn in his campaign to ruin Drew. His plan was simple: bring her home. Convince her to testify that Drew had willingly engaged in drug use and had paid her for a night that Drew now vehemently denied. It was a setup, one meticulously designed to destroy Drew's credibility and, by extension, strip him of every shred of power and influence he still clung to. What Curtis didn't anticipate was that Drew had already made his move. And what Drew did wasn't just strategic, it was monstrous. Behind closed doors, Drew had already approached Jacinda. But this wasn't a gentle plea for help. This was coercion disguised as opportunity. Drew, knowing Jacinda's vulnerabilities and desperation, offered her an ultimatum: help him set up Curtis, or risk being exposed in ways that could ruin her completely. He didn't need to threaten her outright. He only needed to lay out the reality she faced. By the end of their conversation, Jacinda wasn't just frightened, she was trapped. And Drew made sure she understood, this wasn't about justice. This was about leverage. What followed was the execution of one of the most calculated and ruthless traps Port Charles had seen in years. Jacinda, under Drew's direction, agreed to meet with Curtis. She played her part flawlessly, pretending to be reluctant, hesitant, unsure about helping Curtis with his request. But when Curtis finally made his move, sliding cash across the table, gently pressing her to testify that Drew had paid her, had used drugs, had lied to the world, Jacinda leaned in. And as she nodded, as she accepted the money, as Curtis sealed his own fate with a handshake, a camera, hidden discreetly, captured every second of it. Drew watched the footage with chilling calm. There it was, Curtis. Not just planning to destroy him, but doing so through bribery and manipulation. And now, Drew held the one thing more powerful than truth, proof. Tangible, undeniable. Damning evidence that could not only end Curtis's ambitions, but stain his reputation permanently. But this wasn't just a victory. It was a descent. Because Drew wasn't satisfied with simply holding the footage. He wanted Curtis to feel it. To unravel. To know that every move he made was now under Drew's thumb. In the days that followed, Drew sent Curtis a message, cryptic, simple, and devastating: you chose the wrong lie. Curtis knew instantly what it meant. He felt the walls begin to close in. Jacinda wasn't the weapon he had forged, she was the knife now pressed to his own throat. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Curtis, once so sure of his upper hand, began to spiral. He reached out to Felicia, demanding answers. He tried to contact Jacinda, but she had vanished, likely relocated by Drew to keep the leverage intact. Every attempt to spin the narrative was met with silence, or worse, suspicion. Drew, meanwhile, moved through Port Charles like a man reborn. He was no longer on defense. He had become the storm. But power came with a price, and Drew was changing. The man who once held on to integrity, who once tried to rise above the sins of others, was now immersed in a game he used to condemn. He was watching Curtis fall apart, and instead of feeling satisfaction, he felt consumed. Because this wasn't just about winning. This was about making Curtis pay for every ounce of betrayal. For every whisper in a courtroom, for every backdoor deal that painted Drew as the villain. This was about domination. And yet, there was an unsettling irony beneath it all. In trying to expose Curtis as a manipulator, Drew had become one himself. He had used Jacinda, a woman whose past was riddled with pain, as a chess piece in a war between two powerful men. He had justified it as necessary. As survival. But deep down, he knew the truth: this was obsession. This was control. This was vengeance disguised as strategy. The citizens of Port Charles began to notice. Trina, already reeling from Kai's betrayal, saw the darkness in Drew's eyes. Sonny, watching from the sidelines, recognized the same hunger for power he had once seen in Jason. And Carly, torn between loyalty and fear, began to question if the man she had defended for so long was becoming something unrecognizable. Curtis, meanwhile, was unraveling. With every move he made, he second-guessed himself. Every conversation felt like a trap. Every ally, a spy. He knew the footage existed. He knew Drew had it. And worst of all, he knew it would only be used when it hurt the most. Jacinda disappeared from public view, her conscience tangled in the wreckage. She had done what Drew asked. She had helped expose Curtis. But at what cost? Her silence was now a currency traded in shadows, and the guilt of what she had participated in would haunt her long after the last play was made. And Drew? He sat in the center of it all, calm, controlled, and cold. The man who had once been a victim now wore the face of someone who had tasted power and refused to let it go. He hadn't just defeated Curtis. He had dismantled him. Piece by piece. But victory in Port Charles is never clean. And the further Drew descends into this new version of himself, the more he begins to resemble the very enemies he swore to fight. Curtis may be broken, but Drew is now haunted by the silence of Jacinda, the betrayal of his former self, and the eerie realization that he may not have saved his legacy, but destroyed it in the process. The courtroom had descended into chaos. What was supposed to be a calculated proceeding, a controlled legal maneuver within the bounds of strategy and order, had unraveled into a public disaster. The trial had become a battlefield where truth was used like a weapon, where alliances shattered under the weight of betrayal, and where names once respected were now dragged through the mud in front of a watching city. And at the heart of this collapse stood Drew, cold, composed, relentless, delivering the final blow that would send Curtis straight to prison. The charge, bribery. The evidence, airtight. The consequences, catastrophic. Drew had planned this meticulously. From the moment Curtis began his underhanded attempt to manipulate Jacinda into perjuring herself on the stand, Drew knew it would come to this. But what he hadn't anticipated was the storm of collateral damage it would unleash. Because in his effort to destroy Curtis, Drew had enlisted the one person who should never have been part of this war, Kai. Kai had given Drew the key information, the timeline, the meeting location, the precise moment when Curtis and Jacinda would interact. He had done it under the guise of justice, perhaps even out of loyalty to the truth. But the truth was not clean. It was messy, bloody, personal. And now it had exploded into a public scandal that was ripping through the courtroom like wildfire. As the recording played, Curtis offering money in exchange for false testimony, audible gasps rippled through the gallery. The judge struggled to contain the reactions. Trina sat frozen. Her eyes locked not on Curtis, not even on Drew, but on Kai. The man who had stood by her, whispered reassurances, sworn to protect her family, now revealed as the architect of this ruin. The moment their eyes met across the courtroom, 1,000 unsaid things passed between them. And then, her expression shifted, from disbelief to betrayal. The betrayal wasn't just that Kai had shared private information. It was that he had done so with Drew, a man who had spent months trying to bury her family. It was that Kai hadn't warned her, hadn't come clean, hadn't given her a chance to stop the avalanche before it crushed everyone she loved. And now, as her father sat slumped at the defense table, humiliated and broken, Trina felt the bottom of her world collapse. Kai tried to speak to her after the session was adjourned. Tried to explain that he thought he was doing the right thing. That he didn't believe Curtis had the right to destroy someone else's life with lies. That he thought exposing the truth would help. But Trina didn't want justice. She wanted loyalty. And Kai had chosen the one man she never could forgive. Her voice trembled with fury when she finally spoke. You didn't just betray my father. You betrayed me. Outside the courtroom, the city buzzed with headlines. Curtis Ashford charged in bribery scandal. Evidence supplied by unknown source. Drew Kane delivers stunning courtroom blow. And behind every headline was the whisper of Kai's name, though unofficial, unconfirmed, and buried beneath legal discretion. Those who knew understood exactly who had enabled Drew's victory. And they began to question who Kai truly was. A truth seeker? A traitor? A man caught between two worlds with no understanding of the consequences? Inside his apartment, Kai sat alone. The silence pressing against him like a weight. He had believed in Drew's cause. Had convinced himself that taking Curtis down was a necessary evil. But he hadn't anticipated the human cost. He hadn't anticipated Trina's devastation. And worst of all, he hadn't realized that in choosing sides, he had isolated himself from the only person who had ever believed in him without conditions. Meanwhile, Drew stood on the steps of the courthouse like a man vindicated. The media flanked him, but he said nothing. His silence wasn't humility, it was finality. Curtis was finished. The recording, now entered into evidence, had done what years of tension, personal disputes, and moral gray areas never could. It had turned Curtis from a respected community leader into a convicted manipulator. Drew had taken control of the narrative, and with it, the power he believed had been stolen from him for far too long. But as the courtroom emptied and the echoes of the verdict faded, new consequences began to simmer beneath the surface. Because Drew's win came at a price. And that price was paid by those who had never signed up for this war. Trina, fractured and furious, withdrew from Kai entirely. She refused his calls. Blocked his messages. Avoided him at every turn. Their once promising relationship now reduced to silence, tension, and unresolved grief. And though Kai tried to justify his decision, to explain that he had chosen truth over lies, nothing could bridge the chasm that now stretched between them. Curtis, awaiting sentencing, sat behind bars, not just physically, but emotionally. He had gambled, and he had lost. Not just his case, but his daughter's trust. His reputation. His legacy. And the bitter irony was that the one man he had tried to frame had turned the mirror back on him with deadly precision. And Drew, despite the victory, despite the legal advantage, despite the power now returned to him, found himself haunted. Because deep down, he knew he hadn't just taken down Curtis. He had corrupted Jacinda. He had pushed Kai past the point of redemption. He had shattered Trina's faith in the people around her. And he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. What had started as a feud had become an obsession. What had started as strategy had become scorched earth. And now, in the aftermath of this courtroom disaster, Port Charles stands divided. The air is heavy with consequences. Loyalties are strained. Relationships are crumbling. And Kai, once a symbol of quiet strength, now stands as the embodiment of misplaced judgment. The fire is far from out. Because this trial wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. A reckoning. A psychological war. A spiral that threatens to consume everyone still standing. And the next explosion? It's only a matter of time. The chaos Drew left behind didn't vanish when the handcuffs closed around his wrists, it only escalated, spreading through Port Charles like a silent contagion. Consuming the lives of everyone who had stood in his path or become entangled in his descent. And now, in the grim and uncertain hours following his arrest, two women found themselves on the brink of danger they never saw coming, Portia and Trina. For weeks, Drew had operated with surgical precision, manipulating people, orchestrating traps, and weaponizing secrets in a relentless campaign to destroy Curtis. He had corrupted Jacinda, blackmailed allies, and, most chilling of all, used Kai's misplaced loyalty to fracture Trina's trust. But in his obsession with control, Drew made one fatal miscalculation. He believed he could start a war without creating collateral damage. He believed he could isolate Curtis without anyone else getting caught in the blast. And now, Portia and Trina were living proof of how deeply wrong he had been. With Drew now in custody, arrested on multiple charges including obstruction of justice, blackmail, and evidence tampering, the house of cards he built was collapsing fast. But before the dust could even settle, an even more terrifying question emerged. What had Drew set in motion before he was taken down? Because Drew had enemies, far more than the public ever realized. Powerful men and women who had profited from secrecy, who had operated in the shadows alongside him or against him. And when Drew fell, they didn't just walk away. They began hunting for the loose ends that could tie back to them. And the most vulnerable targets? The two women who had dared to speak up, to fight back. To stand at the edge of his conspiracy and refuse to fall in line. Portia was the first to feel it. It began subtly, strange calls to the hospital with no voice on the other end. Patients suddenly reassigned. Medical files inexplicably corrupted. Then came the anonymous messages, threats without signatures, accusations disguised as warnings. She reported them, of course. But there was no clear suspect. No proof. Only the growing certainty that someone was trying to silence her, punish her for whatever Drew's enemies believed she knew. Trina, meanwhile, experienced a more chilling kind of danger. Her social media accounts were hacked, her personal photos leaked. She began receiving cryptic messages referencing her time with Kai. Her father's downfall, even her mother's past. The messages weren't just invasive, they were psychological warfare, intended to isolate her, to make her doubt everyone around her. She tried to confront it head-on, but the more she pushed, the more paranoid she became. Strangers followed her in the park. Her apartment door was found slightly ajar one night. Though nothing was stolen. Every creak, every knock, became a possible threat. The connection was clear. Someone out there believed Portia and Trina held pieces of Drew's final plans, information. Leverage, evidence that had yet to be uncovered. And whether they actually did or not no longer mattered. The perception alone was enough to place targets on their backs. With Drew silent behind bars and refusing to name names, the storm raged around them without direction or control. Curtis, still reeling from his own public disgrace, tried to protect them. But his influence had been shattered by Drew's takedown. The courtroom footage of his bribery still played on local news stations, and every time he walked into a room, heads turned in judgment. He was powerless to stop the threats that now surrounded his daughter and the woman he once called his wife. And Kai? The man who had unwittingly triggered the spiral now found himself unable to reach either of them. Trina had cut him off completely, and Portia refused to return his messages. But that didn't stop his guilt. He paced outside their apartment in silence, day after day, knowing that his actions, intended to stop one monster, had instead unleashed many. Meanwhile, in his cell, Drew remained unshaken. When questioned about the threats to Portia and Trina, he showed no visible emotion. But beneath the surface, something cold and detached lingered. Had he expected this? Or had he planned for it? Did he unleash something darker before his arrest, files set to release, alliances triggered like bombs on timers, ready to detonate regardless of his freedom? The authorities scrambled to contain the fallout. Anna, brought in to oversee the internal review of Drew's actions, began to suspect that the former hero had built a web so complex that even his imprisonment wouldn't stop the consequences from playing out. She warned Portia to stay vigilant. She assigned temporary security detail to Trina. But even Anna knew, if Drew had set something in motion, if this was only part of a larger design, they were already too late. The most chilling part? No one knew who was behind the threats. Was it someone still loyal to Drew? Was it a rival who feared what he left behind? Or was it Drew himself? Having orchestrated everything so thoroughly that even from his cell, he remained the most dangerous man in Port Charles? What was clear was this: Portia and Trina were no longer bystanders. They were targets. And the war that Drew started was far from over. It had mutated, grown teeth in the dark, turned inward, and begun devouring the lives of those who had the most to lose. And as the walls closed in, one terrifying truth emerged. Drew may have lost his freedom, but in unleashing his madness, he had taken control of something even more powerful: fear. And now, fear ruled everything.